Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I can't. Yeah, people seem like they can hear me. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to this webinar in our ACH's MMB series, partnering with the University of Bristol. We have two speakers today. Unfortunately, one of our speakers had to withdraw. So we have Dr. Ida Yazici, apologies if that's not the pronunciation of your family name, from the University of Bristol. So Ida is a research associate on the PRIME project. Her research sits at the intersection of the sociologies of cities, race, and migration. Her EIIC funded PhD research in sociological studies at the University of Sheffield looked at the policy of asylum dispersal and the dynamics of urban belonging. Ida is also an honorary research fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick, where she worked on the Open City project. So I'll hand over to Ida for now, and then later we will hear from Emma from ACH. So Ida, I'll pass over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, just waiting for my slideshow to boot up. I'm Eda Yazıcı from Prime. Thank you so much for the introduction, Tom. So I am a greedy speaker. So the first thing I'm going to do is set a timer, and hopefully I can be chaired strictly if I find myself going over. But as this event is sort of focused on the crossover between third sector organisations and higher education institutions, I wanted to focus a little bit on the ethics of doing migration research, so focusing on sort of methods and research design, but specifically focused on collaborations with the third sector and how we can start thinking about discomfort around ethics in the field and developing and designing research and collaboration. So the presentation itself will be mostly aimed at generating discussion. So I'll primarily focus on the PRIME project, which is the project that I'm working on at the moment at Space in the University of Bristol. And I'll also use a couple of quotes and examples from previous research projects just to provoke discussion, and hopefully then we'll hear less of me speaking and be able to have more of a conversation. So the PRIME project looks at the conditions and experiences of irregular migrants in Europe. It's Horizon funded, so we're conducting research across the European Union and in five sectors, five national contexts and four sectors of the economy. So I'm currently doing research with people who have been irregularized by their legal status, so are in different situations of insecure legal status, working in agriculture and food processing, waste management, recycling, restaurants, and older adult care. And as part of the PRIME project, have built connections with a range of different third sector organisations working in this space, as well as trade unions. So the first thing I want to talk about in the presentation is about gatekeepers and the ethics of access when doing research and how we collaborate with third sector organisations. Then thinking about some of the reactions and responses of different gatekeepers and different organisations we've collaborated with. And then I'm going to move on to research participants' experiences of being researched and being the subject of research. And finally, I'm going to start to talk about alternatives and sitting with discomfort while reflecting on ethics and starting to think more widely to sort of the institutional barriers, the constraints on conducting everyday ethical research. See, next slide. So the first section, I'm going to be reflecting on the dynamics of power in migration research. I'll focus on circuits of value and exchange. And I think in the academic literature, there's a lot of engagement with the dynamics of power in migration studies that focuses on recognizing, addressing, rebalancing power between researchers and people who are the subjects of research. But I think there's less attention paid to sort of tripartite research, tripartite power analysis between participants, NGOs or third sector organisations, and researchers in the context of the funding space that third sector organisations are in, and also the way that higher education institutions are funded. So I'm going to briefly talk about each of the organisations that Prime has researched with and has been using these relationships to reach participants, to recruit participants for research. And with each of the organisations we've worked with, we've adopted a slightly different model, which I think speaks to the sort of the reflexivity and adaptability of doing migration research in different contexts. And I'm going to reflect very briefly on the different outcomes, implications of these different approaches to conducting research for the balance of power between us as researchers at a university and also the people we research with and with each of the organisations. So each approach has yielded very different outcomes with different implications for research relationships in the third sector. And I'm going to speak briefly to each of these examples before reflecting on possible alternatives, perhaps more co-productive approaches. And I'm going to focus on the ethics of trust and the desire to protect potential participants, but also the dual capacity for extraction, both extracting stories and experiences from research participants and third sector organisations positioning themselves within these dynamics of extraction. So with one organisation, we used a facilitation fee. So said, look, we'd really want to approach around 10 interviewees working in this sector who hold the following legal statuses. If we're to arrange a facilitation fee paid directly to your organisation, would you be able to negotiate access and introduce us to participants? So in that setting, basically what happened was that we sort of set our requests and that third sector organisation returned to us with a list of names having pre-screened potential participants. Another approach that we've used is more akin to sort of neoliberal outsourcing with a third sector organisation that's trying to develop its research capacity and has so far worked with one university before and wants to create its own in the long term research team and develop its own research. So we said, okay, well, why don't you conduct interviews for us after we deliver training and after we maybe conduct 1 or 2 interviews together? And in that situation, so much of the access we were able to negotiate was constrained by the capacities and physical limitations of the charity. So we were at an immigration advice session, there wasn't an interpreter available. And so the interviews that we got weren't quite the interviews that we were expecting. And with some of the other interviews, the person conducting them and her particular research background meant that the findings or the data wasn't quite in line with our expectations for doing sort of qualitative, in-depth research with migrant groups. Another approach that we've taken is to say, well, actually, how can we contribute to you as a third sector organisation? You know, could we potentially add into our interview schedule a couple of questions that might be useful to support your own work? Or can we produce some writing or a report that will support your sort of grant seeking? So these are the different approaches we've taken. And the one that's really differed is with a trade union, where we said, look, you're delivering this organizer training, and we've got, you know, these research findings from the research that we've done so far. Why don't we co-deliver a training? And through that, would you be able to kindly help us access some potential research participants? So that's another approach that we've taken. And finally, another approach that we've taken is to simply be invited in, no strings attached, to a community organisation to observe and then to meet people. So there are lots and lots of different ways of approaching access. And of course, navigating that relationship between gatekeepers and participants, I think, poses really complex ethical questions, both for the sort of potential parachuting in or extractiveness of research and for the time and resources of third sector organisations. And in fact, when I was negotiating access with one charity partner, the project officer I was speaking with listens to me describe the Prime project in great detail, and then sort of frustratedly said, "Don't you researchers ever talk to each other?" Because he'd had other researchers approach him to conduct interviews with the same group of people working in similar sectors of the economy. And incidentally, in that particular situation, I was like, "Oh, do you mean such and such's research? Yes, I've read their book." But it speaks to, I think, the way that research institutions, different research institutions and different networks of researchers often end up doing similar or related projects, and often end up trying to negotiate access through the same or similar organizations. So there's almost a sense of research fatigue among third sector organizations. And so that raises the question of how we can possibly avoid repetition, and how we can possibly avoid research fatigue without being a drain on charities' resources. And thinking about those different approaches, I think, necessitates an engagement with how participants feel about it. So here's a quote from a research participant from a previous piece of research, where basically Chish is saying, "I am sick of being researched. I'm sick of participating in research interviews. These people come into this charity that I receive support from. They say they're going to share transcripts with me, but they never do. They say they're going to keep in touch, but they never do. Or they say they're going to change the asylum system completely, but they never do." And I think about this interaction often, because I think, are there research participants I've researched with since who say similar things about me? And for me, this quote raises a few different issues that can be read in line with what I've said so far about the relationship between NGOs and researchers. And I think the first is thinking about the sheer volume of research that goes on in these spaces. Then there's the issue of labour and resource in the third sector, especially with the reliance on volunteer labour and time. And also that some NGOs, such as the one that Chish is speaking about in this quote, no longer accept any forms of researcher. They say, no, thanks, we're done. We just don't have the time and capacity for this. And this is having an adverse impact on our service users or the people that we work with. But the flip side of this is that these sort of dynamics of extraction can also be present with charities working with their service users. So there are people I've researched with who've become the face of certain charities. One participant from a previous project described speaking at this huge charity gala. Another, because she has the most infectious smile in the world, I think, is like all over every promotional poster and Instagram and social media post of another charity. But in this, again, another quote from a previous research project about a participant who'd been asked to speak at a charity's fundraising event. And one of the staff members at the charity said, what is a quite racist trope about colonialism, and saying, well, they've delivered railways, so it's not all bad. And in this situation, the participant said nothing and just sort of bottled it up and gave this presentation trying to bring resources into the charity anyway. So I think all of these raise quite complex questions that I think we need to ask about how we collaborate, how we do ethical research, and how we do ethical research that cuts across the third sector and higher education. And I think this requires an engagement with how higher education institutions are structured and funded, about how third sector organisations are structured and funded, and about financial flows between higher education institutions and NGOs and back again. And then also thinking about building long-term relationships with research participants, thinking about how we avoid stealing people's stories and disappearing, and how we can build long-term meaningful relationships across the third sector and higher education and with research participants over protracted periods of time, given institutional constraints. And just before I wrap up, I wanted to think a bit about how we might sit with discomfort or how we might sit with anxieties in the field, particularly around research ethics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches, and in particular co-production approaches, which are often held up as like a silver bullet that will make the extractiveness of research or the sort of more ethically dubious aspects of research relationships disappear. And I wanted to reflect on how, even though, say, a co-production approach might flatten the asymmetries of power, they don't necessarily imply an equivalence or equity between the people involved in the co-productive research. And so that raises the question of how we remain attuned to and acknowledge those asymmetries. So how do, say, the logistics of money and contracts shape social interactions in the field and back again? And do co-productive approaches actually enable certain types of research to be more extractive rather than less? So then that raises the question of how we recognize inequalities in research and how we begin to think in a more holistic way and start to think about how and where value is produced and for whom. So just to sort of wrap that up, I guess, the sort of questions I wanted to pose for discussion is how we focus on building relationships and ethics, sort of affective ethics, how we acknowledge the diverse agendas of research participants who might have a particular motivation for taking part, the different agendas of third sector organisations, and the different agendas of researchers who might be trying to make a career for themselves, and then also thinking about challenging the institutional barriers to ethical research. So yeah, that's me. It'd be really great. I have overspoken, but hopefully not by too much. But yeah, it'd be really great to hear people's thoughts and start to think about how we can work through some of these challenges and tricky questions together. I'm going to stop sharing now so you can see my face.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Ida. In terms of questions, I don't think participants are able to ask questions directly because they'll be muted. So if you do have any questions regarding that presentation or the one to come, if you put them in the chat, then we can come to them collectively at the end after Emma's presentation. So our next speaker is Emma Gaspar-Yates from ACH. She graduated with a first-class degree in politics from the University of Bristol and has been working for ACH around 7 or so years and is currently our Senior Support and Integration Manager, and she will be speaking about her perspective from working on the ground in terms of this question. So I'll hand you over to Emma.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I hope you're enjoying the webinar so far. And thank you to Tom for the intro. So today, I think it would be best if I just gave a broad overview of what we do and to kind of introduce some of the ethical considerations that we need to take into account in our work. Some of these are broadly related to working with any at-risk group, and there are other ethical considerations that I think come into play more when you're working with people of a migrant and refugee background specifically. So just to introduce ACH a little bit and the support team specifically, we provide support and integration services in a supported accommodation framework. So most of the people that we are working with are living in our houses, and they have support workers that deliver individually tailored kind of support to these people. This will be based on a support plan that we'll co-design with each of the people living with us, and will aim to kind of help people decide their goals for the future and how to reach them. So in terms of ethics, it's very important in this work to prioritize certain ethical considerations, especially when you're working with groups that can be considered at risk, who may have a lack of access to services, may not be aware of their rights, their responsibilities also. So I think general ethical considerations and principles when you're working with people who can be in at-risk groups. You have to make sure to maintain professional boundaries in order to avoid conflicts of interest. You have to respect the rights of the individual to make informed decisions. You also need to try and empower that individual to have the information that they need to be able to make the best decisions for themselves and for their interests. It's important for our teams to remain competent. We need to make sure that the information that we're giving people is good, is up to date, is transparent. And obviously there are issues, for example, maybe around conflicts of interest, accepting gifts. These, I think, relate to any team that's working in this sector. It could be a social work team, could be anyone, any teams delivering services to people that are in a vulnerable position. And then I think also you have specific ethical considerations that may come into play more when you're working with people from a refugee background, from a migrant background. So we have to take into consideration the fact that there is, for many of the people we work with, a very high chance that they've experienced very traumatic situations. That could be in their country of origin, that could be en route coming to the UK, it could be having arrived in the UK and, you know, being at risk of exploitation, being involved in a very traumatic asylum system as well. So relating to trauma, we have to be aware. Staff need to be trained. We need to know how to spot when trauma is affecting people, affecting potentially their behaviours, how they're reacting. We need to make sure we avoid re-triggering people in our behaviours. But we also can't assume that everybody has gone through that. So we have to respect the individual, and we can't assume that everyone has experienced the same. That's something for us to consider. Another aspect of working with refugees and people from migrant backgrounds is most of the people we work with are very new to the UK. There can be big gaps in their knowledge of what are their rights, what are their responsibilities as UK residents. There can be gaps in knowledge of UK systems, UK laws, and for that reason, one of our key roles is to make sure that we're giving good, thorough, honest, true, up-to-date information to people so they can make decisions for their lives to get the outcomes that they want and to make sure they can navigate life in the UK. So that is one of the key aspects of our role. Support teams will help people with a very broad range of issues. We'll try and help people access services, teach people how to navigate UK systems, such as like the health system, education, employment, legal. We also need to recognise our own remit and where our remit stops. We can't give certain specialist information. We need to refer out of the organisation in that case to make sure we're not overstepping, because the information that we give people could be the main source of information about life in the UK, other than maybe information they're getting from their own communities. So it's important that we're giving good advice. There can be other issues at play and ethical considerations. Obviously, everyone's coming from different countries, different cultures, so it's important for our teams to be culturally aware. We need to be respectful of people's cultures and have some understanding and some training around different cultures, different views. An ethical consideration can be, though, if a cultural norm comes into conflict with the UK law. So we need to make people very aware of certain things. An example of that could be maybe polygamy, very normal, legal in a lot of countries, but obviously not legal in the UK. And it's important that we make people aware of these things. Again, so people can make informed choices. I think a general ethical consideration to consider is always the balance between acting in the individual's best interests and also acting in society's best interest, and making sure that these things balance and trying to resolve any conflicts that there can be between the two. Obviously, ACH is in a position of we are not a governmental body, and we make people aware of that. It's important that people know what our role is. And we need to advocate for our clients. We need to make sure we're advocating for their best interests and helping them to get good outcomes. And it's also our responsibility to make them aware of their responsibilities as UK residents. And that is a fundamental part of integration, we feel. So it's kind of balancing these things. Some of them, as I said, are related specifically to migrants and refugees. There are ethical considerations when working with any vulnerable group. I've named a few of them, but there are more. And I think that's kind of it. I'm happy to take any questions. If there's anything you'd like me to talk about further, I just wanted to give a broad overview of some of the things we have to take into account of. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for that. I can see that there's been a couple of comments and questions put into the chat. Prior to looking at those, if we could, I'll briefly pass to Dr. Bridget Anderson from the University of Bristol. She is the director of the Migration Mobilities Bristol and the Professor of Migration, Mobilities and Citizenship. So I'll just hand over to Bridget briefly, and then we'll come back and look at these questions and comments that we've received. Thank you. Wait, we can't hear you, Bridget, sorry.
Wait a minute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I just have to shake my computer and then it works. I don't know why. Yeah, so I just saying thanks, Tom, and thanks to Eda and Emma. And just a couple of kind of off the cuff thoughts. So I think that, so basically in university research, if you're doing a kind of social science project, you do have to go through quite often a very cumbersome ethical procedure. Which is, I would say, quite different from actually undertaking ethical research, and is, you know, a lot of it is really about the institution making sure that it's protected. So I think that ethical applications are not the same as ethical research. I think it's worth observing that actually when I first started doing research on migration, which was in the early 1990s, it wasn't a thing. That was, you know, there weren't journals, there weren't research centres. It was a very kind of niche subject, whereas now we've got dozens of research centres, so many journals, such a big literature, and we have to face the fact that actually things have only got worse for migrants and asylum seekers. So in terms of, you know, well, what is the research doing? I think that is a kind of live question. But on the other hand, I would say that quite often, you know, we're in an environment where thinking about policy-oriented research is quite limiting, because actually the policy environment is not great. And I would say that a lot of our work has to be also about making people think differently, and that there is also a value to that, even if it's not manifest in, you know, in a big policy change. It's not only migrants who get researched in migration research, is a whole host of other people. So in the Prime project that Eda mentioned, you know, there's also employers, for example, and other institutional actors. And it's worth saying that it might be hard to access migrants, but you try accessing someone from the Home Office, you know, they're basically very protected. And I think that does also raise other ethical questions, and they're sometimes quite different from the ethical questions that are raised by people with insecure immigration status, but they are sort of something that is worth considering. So I think we could put that into the mix. I think that one of the things, just going back to the questions of sort of academic approaches, one of the good things I think about academic research, and I'm quite skeptical about it in many ways, is actually people do think a lot about power and positionality And dare I say it, I think we probably think about it more in academia than the third sector thinks about it. And sometimes I think that there could be like an interesting conversation and an interesting exchange around those kind of questions. I think so. Eda raised some sort of structural questions at the end, which I think are really important. And I do think that funding is absolutely key to this, and how research is funded can make it very difficult to do the kind of essentially the slow research that Eda was talking about. Like, I think that probably for both Eda and myself, we rely very heavily on our long-term contacts in this sector. And that's what we bring, so people maybe know us and trust us and sort of understand where we're coming from and understand our politics with a small p. And I think that's not something that really is taken into account when you're kind of looking at project funding. So when you have new researchers who might not have those long-term contacts, I think that sort of the way that projects are funded sort of encourages this sort of extractive approach. And I think that finally, just to flag this question of discomfort, which I think is important. And if anyone's interested, I will be running a workshop on discomfort and research next year. But I think, when we feel uncomfortable about something, and particularly around ethics, it's easy to try and avoid that discomfort, but I think it's usually telling us something, and it's good to kind of, as Eda says, to sort of sit with it and learn from it. And finally, this question of how value is produced, again, that, what is the value that's produced? And I think that's actually really helpful. And I think thinking about value in the broadest sense of the word. So, I mean, one thing, for example, that we can do is actually make the research process itself something that is useful to participants. So, so participants, and again, I suppose I'm thinking particularly here of migrant participants, they might not be interested in whether or not policy changes, because actually, however long that time frame is going to be like a long time after their claim or whatever has been heard. So, but actually making it so that, there's an environment where perhaps in the research process, they might be able to meet an immigration advisor or meet other people in similar situations through the research process, I think is something that we can offer. And maybe that's something that we can also think a bit more about. So that's just my kind of thoughts from listening to the two presentations.
Thank you for that, Dr. Anderson. So what I'll do now is I'll take the question from the Q&A tab first, and then we'll go through the chat in the order the comments were received and see if any of the speakers wish to address anything there. So from the Q&A function, we have a question from Shalini for Eda. What are your thoughts of organisations co-production washing their research to continue framing their research work as collaborative?
Shall I just jump in and respond directly?
Yes, please.
Yeah. What a great question. I think it's a real issue. And actually, when you start to look at the history and emergence of co-production, it first started coming about as almost at the sort of moment of the birth of neoliberalism, as a way for cash-strapped local authorities to reduce the cost of service delivery. So it first sort of kicked off in the US in the 70s, at a time when there was a lot of autonomous organizing happening against the state and against local authorities. And it's quite interesting that its birth began with state-delivered services. And with co-production coming into the sort of UK third sector and to some extent the academic mainstream, it's really funny that it actually, not funny, interesting, that it really took off around 2010. And even in like the Conservative Party manifesto, I don't know if you guys remember, but it was like, oh, this is an invitation to participate in the work of government. You know, this sort of almost big society discourse of using the language of participation to cut costs on one hand, and then also using the language of collaboration to suggest that there is an equal partnership. And I think the core issue there is like recognizing that even if you're trying to seek a more equitable partnership, that doesn't necessarily mean equal or truly equitable partnership. Ultimately, there is one organization kicking off the project, and ultimately, you know, the participant might be involved for a short period of time, but the people delivering the initiative will be involved for much longer. So I do think that there is, as you say, like this element of co-production washing that kind of raises the question of, you know, what is the point of research? As Bridget was saying, you know, what is the meaningful value produced from research collaborations with third sector organizations? And also, what does that value mean for when, thinking about it from a research perspective, we're writing about research? You know, if you're writing about research, you're often saying the things that are more in line with metrics for research impact, but you're sidelining or not mentioning the meaningful relationships that you've developed, or the long-term interaction that you have with those individuals, or the point where you move away from ethics on paper and start adopting ethics in practice. So thinking about some of the constraints and limitations of paper ethics at the university level. So thinking about, you know, you cannot give someone money to recognize their time and contribution, you must give them vouchers. And then thinking about what that then means for ethics in practice and recognizing people and valuing people for their time. I'll stop speaking to give other people a chance. Sorry.
Thank you. That was great. So I'll start now with some of the comments from the other chat. So we have a comment from Shamsa relates particularly, I think, to slide 9 of Ada's presentation. So outcome, not production, crystallizes the problem of ethics in research for research's sake, in which the benefit is boosting expert impression of the researcher with one more potentially useless paper in a publication. I think we've kind of spoken to that. I don't know if you wish to say anything more in relation to that comment.
It's a great comment, and I think, you know, going back to that question of sitting with discomfort, I think it's also recognizing what researchers are aiming to get out of the research that they're doing. You know, if you're thinking about that next step on the career ladder or that other publication, how do you balance those demands out with the sort of the meaning of conducting research with people and the sort of relationalities of research?
Yes, very much. Thank you. And then a second comment from Shamsa as well. Research not anchored with an outcome that does not seek to address a problem identified, or at least seek to develop a project to solve the issues identified, should not be encouraged. Further, when seeking research funding, an allocation to undertake this further research should be encouraged. And I think that, again, that's something we've kind of spoken to already with regards to, and something you've mentioned, I think, there, research for research's sake, right? And look, research should have an outcome focus as opposed to simply being for the sake of the research that's being conducted. We also have a comment from Ramona, so saying, I did a bit of work with ACH on ethical and equitable working with migrant mothers. And I think there are some issues that need to be addressed in terms of university ethics, forms and documentation in terms of engagement with participants and equitability. I don't know, with regards to this kind of issue, I don't know whether, Emma, if you have any comment regarding the types of research that maybe some of our service users are approached to do, and what we would seek in terms of that.
So I think in terms of, say, focus groups, researchers that have collaborated with ACH, you tend to find that potentially the type of outcomes from that research might not be reflective of the kind of overall group of people that we're working with. We do tend to find that you get maybe, there's 10 individuals that love participating, they really want to get their message out. So that could potentially bias sometimes research results, because you end up with quite a niche representation of the people we're working with. I think it is really important that people are compensated for their time. Like, that is true, because otherwise people can end up feeling like they're just kind of getting mined for their data, which is not good. Simultaneously, though, you can also end up with kind of perverse outcomes with the incentivization. You want the people to also be interested in the research that you're doing, and also not just showing up for the sake of the £20 voucher. So it's kind of balancing that somehow. I don't know if that makes sense,
Yes, very much. I think people should be compensated with for their time, but obviously that does then bring with it some inherent issues. Okay, so the next question we have is from Palladia. So she says, thank you for the great presentation. Can you say more about how you think about the value of migration research? It seems like much political discourse / governance has been moving towards anti-fact, anti-evidence policymaking, whereby even highly critical or ethical research is at best ignored and at worst making people more visible and therefore governable. How can we think about value in this context? Would it be something about e.g. actual financial compensation, if there is any? So this kind of links to what Emma said as well, but I wonder if you wanted to say something regarding about the value of migration research.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think what it really points to is what Bridget was saying earlier about the challenging policy setting that we're in. The reality is right now, policymakers aren't going to sit up and say, oh gosh, well, all of our policies are really exclusionary and racist in response to research that we conduct. And I think there's an epistemological question here of why do we produce knowledge and what is knowledge production for? But then there's also a more sort of practical question here about how do we understand, or how do we think of the meaning generated for the people that we research with when conducting research? What are we exchanging? What are we sharing? What are we building? That could be creating a space for people to develop new networks or access things that they weren't able to access before, or finding new ways to organize for change, and sort of crossing that sort of research and activism Rubicon, and thinking about how both researchers and the people that we research with can create approaches to generating knowledge, but more importantly, generating connection that has the potential to lead to change, not necessarily only through the governmental route.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have is for Emma. So it says, Emma, thank you for the interesting talk. Could you give an example of what kind of information has been most useful to the people you've been working with to make informed choices about their lives? Also, has there been any information you feel that you lack to pass on, such as people have asked questions, but you cannot give them a good or clear answer?
Thank you for the question. So I think in terms of the information that we give, which maybe has the greatest impact, is it might not always be information that's well received, unfortunately. I think one of the big challenges for us is we do have to advise people in the midst of a housing crisis. And I think people's main areas of concern is really around housing. Where can they live? Where can they live stably? And I think that might also be where expectations are the most unaligned with what the actual reality on the ground is. So information we give people about, you know, what people's rights to housing are, in fact, what the reality of that is on the ground, what the reality of things like social housing now are like in the UK, where sometimes people's expectations are really radically different to what's actually going on. And I think that can be very difficult for people. I think that bit of information about housing, how you can access it, the private rental sector, you know, we don't give financial advice, but if people wanted mortgages, things like that, people need to have all of these options available to them, at least in terms of the information that they have, because that really does dictate choices you make about pretty much everything else in your life. You know, if your housing's not resolved, then really nothing else is. So it's a conversation that comes up almost daily from my team, and that we're asked almost daily. So that, I think employment rights also is very important, and in terms of what people are aware of and what people are actually, you know, what people are getting paid, what people know about their rights to holiday pay, maternity, paternity, sick pay. Often we find that there's quite a large gap there, and again, it makes a huge difference to people's life outcomes. So that's something we try and share as well. In terms of information that we don't have that we'd like to have, obviously there's certain specialist areas that we wouldn't advise in. Sometimes legal. Obviously you have to be very careful around what advice you give in any kind of regulated setting. So we give some levels of immigration advice. Immigration advice is often something that people come and ask us for. We are regulated to a certain level. I think we have a problem with capacity. We could do a lot more of that work if we had more people able to deliver those services, because, you know, people need to apply for visas for their families, people need to apply for citizenship, and this comes up a lot, and sometimes we're just not able to reach the demand. Yeah, and I think there's generally a problem of our job becomes harder as institutions kind of get worse in the UK, you know. So sometimes it's not about not having the information, but sometimes it's just frustrating for people to hear, you know, waiting lists on the NHS, waiting lists for housing. Sometimes it does feel like you're just relaying unpleasant information and there's no deadline on anything, so that can be quite difficult, I think. But thank you for your question, and I will think if there is anything that we don't know that we need to.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for that. And then following from that, there's been a sort of conversation in the chat between Ramona and Bridget regarding the complexities of paying participants, particularly if they have no recourse to public funds, so if they're still asylum seekers and in the asylum system. And I think that's a challenge that anyone who's tried to sort of do any sort of work with asylum seekers in particular will be aware of. I also just wanted to take the opportunity to remind everyone that this is being recorded. So if for any reason you don't want to be part of the recording, please let us know. But this webinar is being recorded. And Aidan's just mentioned a challenge for anyone with status who's receiving universal credit. Exactly. So the complexities of the benefit system mean that individuals will have to declare any income that they may have received, whether it's, for example, for taking part in research. And this can impact on the amount of universal credit they receive potentially as well. So I think we are coming to the end there. There's no more questions or comments in the chat. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank our two main speakers today. So Ada from the University of Bristol and Emma from ACH. And thank you to Bridget as well for her thoughts there. And we will be continuing this webinar series in the new year. So this is the last one for 2024. But please keep an eye out for that. We will be circulating the information shortly. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye then.
Thanks all. Thanks for having me.